Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I welcome back Kerry Jackson, a fellow at PRI's Center for California Reform. California once had the nation's strongest public safety laws, but voters and lawmakers have recently embraced a shift in crime policy. Kerry's new book, Living in Fear in California, explores the impact these changes have had on California's communities. He also suggests proposals that would strike more balance between our obligation to crime victims and the rights of the accused and convicted. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Next Round, Kerry.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So your new book explores crime in California, which seems to be on the back burner these days, despite the real crime problems you document in your book. In your introduction, you note that California was once tough on crime, embracing policies like 3 strikes you're out, 10-20 life, and the death penalty. More recently, voters have taken an about-face turn despite the success of these policies in reducing crime. What do you account for this shift in attitude by Californians?
I get a sense that if this shift tracks pretty closely with the state's turn to more left-wing voting habits and therefore more left-wing policies. I think the question is, at this point, will the pendulum swing back toward the middle? And I think that likely depends on how far left that it's going to move. Has it stopped? Has it reached the far end of this move, or is it going to go a little bit further? So I think that's the question we have to, and we will see answered in front of us in the next few years.
Kerry, I think you're exactly right. You know, these kind of policies were things that the fringe in the legislature pushed for years, like 10 or 15 years ago. You know, some of them didn't even get out of the first committee hearing. Yet today, those and all these far more sweeping changes are laws. I think you're exactly right in how that tracks with where the state is going. There's been a lot of talk, and especially by advocates of these policies, for how California's big cities are getting safer. You note in your book that there's some warning signs, though, like violent crime surging in Los Angeles and increasing numbers of auto break-ins in San Francisco. What does your research tell you about the state of crime in California's major cities today? And how do you explain the growing problems in LA and San Francisco? At the same time, crime seems to be declining in Oakland. And are there any crime-related trends that you've drawn from California's big cities across the board?
Oakland is an interesting case that you bring up. It has made a focused effort on reducing gang crime, and it's been a program which police become closer, working within the community, and they're not looked at so much as adversaries or as they are as partners in trying to reduce crime. The city's also adopted a data-driven strategy that's helped the law enforcement go beyond what one high-ranking city officer called the days of doing random police work. So they're becoming more efficient. It's also concentrated the police department's efforts on identifying those who are most at risk for being involved or engaged in gun violence. As of now, it looks like the approach is working, at least for Oakland, as violent crime in the city has fallen for 6 straight years through 2017. It's not quite the same in other cities. There have been some other issues going on. Property crime is on the rise in L.A. Violent crime in L.A. is going up. The examples, rape, for one thing, in San Francisco has really been, for a spike from 2012 to 2014, is still going up a little bit. But Oakland seems to, at least working with the trying to get gang violence, get a handle on that, seems to have, I don't want to say has found the solution, but I think they're taking, right now, it looks like they're moving in the right direction with that.
President Trump has been pretty vocal in discussing the growing threat of dangerous gangs like MS-13. Gangs are also a factor in California's major cities. Based on your research, Kerry, how bad is California's gang crime problem today, and what have some cities done to effectively combat gang crime in their communities?
One of the sources I used for the book said that gang crime is still as pervasive as it once was or has always been. It's just moved more underground, more behind the scenes. It's not making the news quite as much as it used to. Maybe it's an image thing for the gangs, but at the same time, the crime is still out there. They're still active. Law enforcement in Los Angeles has had some success in using gang injunctions, which are restraining orders against an entire group. In a sense, these gang injunctions allow police to go a bit further than they otherwise could. They can restrict gang activities by limiting members' movements, even what clothes they wear. These injunctions have been credited with cutting gang crime, but there have also been complaints that the approach goes too far, violates civil liberties. So it's possible they will be discontinued. There is a good bit of opposition out there to them, but it's for, when they have been used, they have been successful.
Kerry, we all expect our public schools to be safe havens from violence. But as you document in your book, incidents of crime are becoming increasingly common on campus. Can you share what you found with us? Should parents be fearing for their children's safety when they send them off to school in the morning? And how are some of these recent dramatic policy changes that you've talked about making it harder for schools to ensure safe learning environments for all students?
Far too many public schools teachers don't have control of the classrooms anymore. The students do, and this is dangerous both for the students and the teachers. There are teachers who get injured and beaten up in cases. These dangers have increased because of a policy handed down by the previous administration that in fact forced schools to limit student suspensions, so students can get away with a lot and they were not removed from school. Oftentimes, I believe police should have been brought in, they weren't. They let these kids stay in class. They become disruptive and they become violent. At least the current administration has dropped those guidelines, but I think the best way if parents want to ensure the safety of their children is to place them in charter schools. But unfortunately, there is an ongoing war in this state being waged against charter schools. So that is an option is becoming less and less of an option. At least now the administration has rescinded the guidelines that the previous administration had in place on school suspension. So maybe school officials will get the message and fix that problem to the extent that they can.
The heart of your book explores how well-meaning but misguided policy changes, some enacted by the legislature and others by voters, are contributing to rising incidents of crime and a feeling by many Californians that their neighborhoods are less safe. Three sweeping changes are often cited in tandem: Public Safety Realignment, Prop 47, and Prop 57. For our listeners who may be unfamiliar with them, what specifically did each of these measures do, and how have they negatively impacted public safety in California? And what reforms do you recommend in your book to fix these policy mistakes?
Well, the state's prison system's capacity of number of inmates, population of inmates, had grown way beyond what it was designed to hold. So part of these were, designed to help relieve those overpopulation problems, the difficulties. Even the federal courts got involved and said you can't have this many people in your system. Prop 47 in particular reclassified some felonies to cut them down to misdemeanors. This was another way of trying to cut the prison population. All three were a giant swing away from California's reputation as a hard-on-crime state, which is, had that reputation as recently as the 1990s. Some are going to argue that these changes, Props 47, 57, realignment, as far as cutting back on the prison population, haven't really increased criminal activity. But from what I've seen in the data, it's probably a little too early to tell one way or the other the effect. They just haven't been around long enough to give us a clear answer. The sample size is simply too small. Rather than empty the prisons, I shouldn't say empty, but the way they have tried to cut the prison population and relieve the overcrowding, maybe they should have looked more into moving inmates to out-of-state facilities rather than risk putting dangerous felons back on the street. Lawmakers need to go back and look at the more serious crimes that have been reclassified as minor offenses and fix the errors of Prop 47. And this might be fueling some, or saying the rash of automobile break-ins in the Bay Area cities, which skyrocketed in recent years.
Kerry, that's exactly right. This is an issue that, I worked on closely when I worked in the legislature, and it seems like more of a pass-the-buck approach, that we're shifting all of these really serious and repeat felons from state prison to local communities who are just overwhelmed. They don't have the capacity, they don't have enough trained officers to handle this mass influx of serious and repeat criminals into their communities, and then you're adding all these policy reductions to misdemeanors on top of that. It's really kind of a perfect storm. And as you say, I think it'll be interesting to watch how the trend continues, because I think, when we talk about crime rates versus is how people feel and the anecdotes. This is right what we're talking about, that there are so many. In fact, I have spreadsheets of examples of people who became crime victims who never would have been had the perpetrators been in state prison in the first place.
That's an ugly thing that's happened, yeah. And the transitioning from the state prison system has actually put a lot of strain on resources at the sheriff's department and police department levels, for sure.
So I think that'll be interesting to watch. Guns are a big topic of debate in California and nationally when you talk about crime, and also when we're dealing with these unfortunate, all too common incidents of mass shootings. And you highlight an issue in your book where the Attorney General's office really isn't doing their job regarding a state database that's really used to prevent dangerous criminals who are not permitted to have firearms, it's against the law already, from acquiring them. So talk about this problem and what can be done to ensure that this information about criminals who shouldn't have access to guns is actually being fully implemented into the state database.
California is no Second Amendment haven at all. It has maybe the strictest gun laws in the country. Owning a gun here is very difficult, at least if you're a law-abiding citizen. But despite all these laws, the state can't seem to keep firearms out of the hands of those who have forfeited their constitutional rights to own guns by committing serious and vicious crimes. There's been some blame placed on, as you say, the Attorney General's office. It's supposed to fill in a database of names of those who shouldn't be owning firearms. And this was based on a bill passed more than 20 years ago. Well, I'm sorry, close to 20 years ago. I believe it was 2001, so it would be 18 years. At the same time, there are names of those who shouldn't have lost their Second Amendment rights appearing on this list and this database. And so they're losing what's their constitutional right. It seems like a very large mess, and there's a lot to be fixed here by Sacramento, and it's not going to be fixed overnight. The lawmakers have to put some pressure on the Attorney General's office. At the same time, there are a lot of names of those who shouldn't be on the list. They should not have lost their Second Amendment rights, but yet they've ended up in the database, and then they end up being criminals when they're otherwise law-abiding citizens. There's a lot to be fixed here, but they've had, as I say, nearly 20 years to get this right, and they still can't seem to get it right. So rather than focus on some of the things that they're focusing on in Sacramento that are really not relevant, not big deals, this is one that they should focus on and get fixed.
And you're exactly right on that. This is what the gun dealers use in the moment, that app's database. This is supposed to be the right in the moment where yep, this person is on the list, or yep, this person isn't. And you're exactly right. It's a mess that needs to be cleaned up.
That's their job. They're the ones who set it out for themselves, so they need to take care of it.
So, Kerry, public safety is naturally thought of as one of the core functions of government. Even most libertarians would recognize that. But as you make the case in your book, there are some private sector solutions to alleviate California's crime problem and save taxpayers money at the same time. Share a few of those with our listeners.
Private prisons are a worthwhile alternative to the government-run prisons. Again, and that goes back to the overcrowding and the transitioning of inmates out of prisons, putting them back on the streets, some of them before they really should be. Private prisons cost less per inmate, and they actually have a lower recidivism rates than state-run prisons or government-run prisons. But just as there is against charter schools, there's also a war being waged against private prisons in California. I've also looked at another private sector solution in which victim and offender work out in a totally voluntary basis, an appropriate punishment for small crimes. Sometimes that punishment is simply an agreement that the offender will take an educational course. And in a sense, this course helps the offenders to be rehabilitated. Now, this isn't going to work with gang crimes and very serious offenses and felonies. This is going to work more on a smaller basis. But if you keep somebody who was going to be a shoplifter from pursuing the wrong path in life, if this type of private sector justice, if you want to call it that, can prevent that, then you have actually done a lot of good work for the right reasons in the right way. But unfortunately, again, this type of private sector solution, it seems the state doesn't want to let anybody get involved in making sure there's peace and decency in communities. But these programs have been effectively outlawed in California.
Kerry, as you note, we all pay a heavy toll from crime. It's most obvious when we see our friends and loved ones who are injured or some tragically even lose their lives as victims of crime. But you document in your book that there are other quantifiable societal costs from rising crime rates. So what are some of these costs of crime in California?
Quite often, entire neighborhoods suffer from crime. The property values crash, public spaces are taken over by criminals, and the law-abiding can't enjoy them anymore. In some cases, communities have to deal with the heavy losses in tourism dollars. Why will people visit an area? I believe this is something Hollywood went through, maybe a little before my time in California, probably 80s and maybe into the early 90s, where I don't want to go to Hollywood, I don't want to visit because I might get mugged. There's also investment opportunities that people will pass up on. Who wants to open a business in a crime-ridden area? I don't think too many people do. And doing the research in the book, I found with a Rand Corporation had come up with an interesting list of costs. This was a few years back. They found that a single murder costs society overall more than $9 million. A rape is going to cost society more than $220,000. Aggravated assaults, more than $90,000. Robberies, about $70,000. And of course, the immediate victims are hurt most by the crimes being committed, but the costs spread out from there in wide concentric circles across society.
Finally, Kerry, there are all sorts of statistics that can be cited to show that California remains basically a safe state despite these sweeping policy changes. Yet, as you show in your book, there are numerous anecdotes and stats that show that certain categories of crime may be once again on the rise. Do you think that the state's gentler approach on crime, especially with the increase in homelessness these days, is a slippery slope back to the days when crime was a pretty serious problem in the state?
As we've all heard Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House years ago, decades ago, the U.S. Congress or U.S. House, he said all politics is local. And I think you can say the same thing about the perception of crime. Maybe some criminal activity is down, but if you're living in the Bay Area and your cars are being broken into as never before, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a huge uptick in automobile break-ins in the Bay Area, then you're just going to feel in general less safe. And the same can be said for rural communities where the residents see and feel criminal activity that they feel it contradicts the data because a lot of crimes there are going apparently unreported. Some of the rural folks or victims, they don't bother to report because it's just the law enforcement resources are strained, so they go unreported. But then we have the underreporting issue in Los Angeles, where serious crimes have been entered into reports as more minor crimes. Residents know what they're going through, even if the numbers don't always back them up. And from what I learned researching the book, I think that this best explains the dichotomy of people feeling like it's more dangerous out there, it's more risky, but the numbers may not necessarily back it up.
Kerry, you've done a paper on homelessness, which we'll be putting out in about a month or so. But what do you think about the homelessness problem, and has that increased crime, especially in areas like Los Angeles and San Francisco?
Certainly, it makes people feel quite often more intimidated, which makes you feel like, well, I'm a victim of crime quite often. I mean, if you're walking down the street and you're being seriously harassed by someone for money, for train fare, for whatever, over and over again, you're going to feel less safe. You're going to feel more at risk. You're going to feel like that there may be a crime right around the corner. You do have crimes against society and the community. In fact, again, we go back to public spaces being taken over and the public can't enjoy them anymore. You have trash and you have human waste in the streets and, again, in public places. So these are low-level crimes. People are not necessarily being assaulted, but, again, this affects quality of life. And if you go to really any explanation, or if you talk about crime, it is all about quality of life. And the homelessness situation is affecting that at its base.
And Kerry, I agree with your observation. There's a lot of push on those on the left in Sacramento to say, well, we shouldn't be criminalizing homelessness or criminalizing poverty. And yes, there are a lot of issues at play with these people and the, sorry condition that they're in. But at the end of the day, rising homelessness is a crime against the people of the community, I would say.
Yeah, you can be victimized by that. A small business owner can't get into his shop in the morning because a homeless person is sprawled across the door. Maybe he gets in through the back way, but then he can't have any customers coming in. They're not going to have to step over someone who's not moving or someone who might be an aggressive panhandler or get possibly physically aggressive. So it's a quality of life. Again, back to that again. These are quality of life issues.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
From Kerry Jackson, Tim Anaya, and myself, thanks for listening. You can learn more about our work on California reform by visiting PRI's website at pacificresearch.org. If you're working on your vacation plans, consider mixing policy and cruising. Join PRI and the Claremont Institute for a joint 40th anniversary cruise on the Mediterranean. The cruise starts in Barcelona and ends in Rome with a special tour of the Vatican. Guests include Andrew Roberts, author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, and will include our own Steve Hayward and Sally Pipes. For more details, visit ci-pri.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.